Welcome back to the Mass Podcast. I'm here in person, studio, Gordon, Will Noland from across the pond, and our lovely guest today is Chase, aka Sovereign Bra, from Twitter. As some of you may know, if you haven't, go over there, give him a follow. Tim and Chase have been chatting the last couple of weeks. A lot of good ideas back and forth. And today we wanted to talk about Christian nationalism. All of our minds, 20 debacle, how to put Christians in positions of power in the country, how to facilitate that. Are the people in power right now not sharing the same ideology with respect to the gospel of Christ? But before we get into that, Chase, would you give us a short intro on specifically a couple of things? I want to talk about the Whatever podcast, because I think that's personally how I came across a couple of those clips. And then we'll move into a few other biographical.
Yeah, for sure. So background, my name's Chase, 28 years old, for anybody who doesn't know me. Professional photographer and brand consultant, and as of this past year, newly a social media influencer and a podcaster. I started doing the Whatever podcast back in 2022. It's kind of an interesting story, actually. So Brian Atlas, the host of the Whatever podcast, I used to watch his YouTube videos back when I was in college. He had some viral YouTube videos in 2013 and 2014 was when I saw them. He would do these pretty hilarious social experiments on the street in Santa Barbara. And I saw them go viral on YouTube. I thought they were funny. And that was kind of that. Then fast forward to 2021, I was walking on the street in downtown Santa Barbara. I saw Brian filming another one of his YouTube videos. I recognized him from his YouTube videos, and I walked up. I was like, dude, you're the guy from the Whatever YouTube channel. And he was like, yeah, what's up, man? And so we started talking a bit. Both just kind of liked one another's vibe and talked about collaborating on content at some point in the future. And we exchanged phone numbers. And I heard from him a year and a half later in the summer of 2022. He texted me and he was like, yo, I just started a podcast. Do you want to come on it? And I was like, sure. What's the subject matter? And he was like, dating. And I was like, okay, this could be interesting. Especially because, you know, I'm a Christian, very conservative. A lot of the women here in the area are extremely liberal and godless. And we have very different perspectives on dating and relationships and stuff like that. So I was like, yeah, let's go. Let's send it. Let's have a little bit of fun with this and try and glorify God. So I went on the show, did like 7 episodes back in 2022. They were fun, but I started to get pretty tired of doing the podcast because every single conversation with these young women was the exact same. It's like all of the young women around here, like they all have the same perspectives on literally everything, the same programming when it comes to feminism, abortion, dating, marriage, all these different things. And so it was like going into each podcast, I kind of knew what the girls were going to say before they would even say it. So I started to get pretty over it. And I told Brian, I was like, dude, like I'll do a couple more episodes. And at the time there was like, each episode had like a couple hundred live viewers. The shows would only get like 10,000 views. Nobody really knew about it. And I was like, I don't know how valuable of a use of my time this is. And after 6 episodes, I told Brian, I was like, I'll do one more, but this is how I think we should do it. I told him, let's get the most liberal, degenerate women we possibly can on the panel. And then let's also put the most conservative Christian women that we possibly can on the panel. And he was like, okay, that sounds like a good idea. So that was episode 33 of the podcast, which was the episode when Kiko freaked out because I said that I wouldn't have sex with a tranny because it would make me gay. And that was in, I think, October or November of 2022. And we did that episode. That was that. I told Brian, I was like, man, You really should consider taking a break from the podcast and just going and cutting clips from the shows, because you are sitting on an absolute gold mine of content here, but there's very few eyes on the podcast. You should, cut clips, throw them up on TikTok. The TikTok algorithm is crazy. You can get insane exposure even if you have no followers on TikTok when you throw up a clip on there. And you should do that for the show, and people will start discovering it. And he was like, "You think so?" I was like, "Absolutely." So we did that, started cutting some clips. One of the first clips that went viral was I told these two twins that were on the show, they were super argumentative, had just terrible attitudes, super independent boss babe, I'm never going to submit to a man kind of mentality. I told them on the show, I was like, good luck to your future husbands one day. I think you guys are going to be a serious handful. And they got so mad at that. And this one girl was like, I think you have a tiny dick. That was her response to me saying that. And I was like, okay, all right, gotcha. That was one of the first clips that went viral. And then all these like red pill accounts online started finding the show, and they started going and cutting clips from it themselves, because they were like, there's all these red pill accounts that are hunting for good dating content. And so they started hunting through the show's episodes and cutting clips. And then it just kind of started to take off from there. And in January of 2023, a few more clips started to go viral. And then in February of 2022, the clip of Kiko freaking out at me for not wanting to have sex with a trans person went nuclear viral. And that was crazy to watch, man. Like, it was such a weird experience. I was just, like, here I am just like doing my own thing here in California. I had a small Twitter account at the time. I think I had like 8,000 followers or something like that. Nobody really knew who I was. And then there I am just watching these clips of me speaking pop up on my own X feed. It was Twitter at the time, pop up on my own Twitter feed, and then just go completely nuclear viral across the internet. And I was sitting there watching it just like, this is insane. What the hell? Yeah, and everything kind of took off from there.
Yeah, so chose to lean
Yeah.
some lines in the sand. I don't want to get too graphic. Sponsorship of whatever that you're pleased with, just in general, that you up now, traditionalism, that a little bit more about why you chose that direction, like a Spotify promo comments of.
Yeah. So before anything ever happened with the Whatever podcast, I would speak with, my closest best friends who are Christians. And my perspective on men in our modern world, particularly men that are living for Christ, is that it's like this, man. We're in a spiritual war, obviously, as you guys know. Paul describes it in Ephesians 6. I view my place in this life as like, I have been appointed by God. You guys have been appointed by God. We've all been appointed by God as men to live during this time and to take our stand against the schemes of the devil. And it's extremely important that we do that. And for years with my closest friends, I would pray to God, like, Lord, please give me an opportunity to make my stand on the spiritual battlefield of our times. Please give me my opportunity to glorify you with the gifts and the talents that you've given me. Please, give me the opportunity to make big wins for the kingdom on the battlefield. And that's always been my intention. And God answered those prayers by giving me a platform and a microphone culturally to make a difference for him. And so everything that I've been given with, like, I think I have like 140,000 followers now on Twitter, the opportunities that I've had with podcasting, so on and so forth. All of these opportunities have been entrusted to me by God. And my goal is to do the best that I can to use them for his glory. Like, I'm not interested in selling out. I'm not interested in compromising my soul or my voice or my integrity for a paycheck. I don't want to do that. I want to live for God as best as I possibly can. And so when, when Brian is advertising a sex toy on the show, or whatever is happening, it's like, okay, I see a responsibility there for me, because I helped make the show what it is, and I want it to have a positive impact on our culture. That's always been, my intention with the show. Like I've wanted it to help men actually become better men and not drain their life force through masturbation and stuff like that. And so it's like, when I see something like that happen, it's like, okay, I'm going to draw a line in the sand there. When I see other degeneracy happening throughout our culture, it's like, I'm going to draw a line in the sand here. Whenever I see anything that's explicitly anti-Christ and anti-God and anti-God's glory, like, I'm going to do what I can to the best of my ability to make a stand against it. And so that's just what I've been trying to do. It's a huge privilege to have the platform that God's given me. And I know that he could take it from me at any moment. And so I'm going to keep trying to glorify him with it.
Don't let me keep talking but following up with that, when Tim out to you had suggested the topic of Christian nationalism, talk about, we haven't really focused too much on that. I mean, you wrote an entire book about mine by a long shot, Catholic Republic. Our computer is sitting on Catholic Republic, right? It's the book.
It's better as a book than yeah, I mean, at least I think so. Yeah, so when I wasn't even sure if we could put this in the title of a YouTube video, Bill, Chase. This is kind of experimental, frankly, because I'm not sure what the algos will do to a video called Christian Nationalism. And it's such a big topic, and it's usually treated of so incautiously that, Chase, when you're like, why don't we nationalism? The day too. I thought this was a great topic to discuss, and it's, again, even though it was in some sense the topic of my first book, I think we should get going on it. But it's interesting because it's a term that designates something in the popular mind immediate. Everyone thinks they have the phantasms to talk about Christian nationalism. And when you talk about what's actually required from Christian nationalism, from the way it's been developed in intellectual history over the last 1,000 years, which is a very rich history, it's something that's not like opposite, but it's got more pointers and more signposts than people assume. So, I think it was Will, the tweet you sent me by James Lindsay was a strong insinuation that anyone who engages in Christian nationalism and takes a stance against what's come to be known as classical liberalism or liberalism is engaging in identity politics. And I thought that's the greatest header for setting up some boundaries, so we stick out like four corners of what any of us ought to hope to mean or ought to hope to see by Christian nationalism, if that makes sense. And we're approaching it from a Christian perspective, but maybe with different markers. I think, Chase, having talked to you about this just a little bit, that we would envision something highly similar. I mean, for instance, let me just throw this out there. The United States of America has, as a cultural marker, I think it's set up of all the modern governments, the most akin to the way that the Roman Empire dealt with the expanding issue after the Protestant Reformation of whether or not a country would be a Catholic country or a Lutheran country. And most people simply don't know. Chase, I'm curious what your take on this, and Will, yours too. The United States in 1788 and after 1791, when the Bill of Rights was ratified, had 8 of 13 states, it had expected 13 of 13 that had Christian establishments, and they were allowed to decide for themselves what Christian sect it would be, whether it would be Catholic or one of the Protestant sects. That's very, very close to the way that the Roman Empire and the medieval church, the Peace of Augsburg is what it was called in 1555, dealt with new multilateral Christianity. And that does a lot of stuff. And I'm not trying to talk about all the Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox sectarianism. What I'm trying to show is that the United States of America foundationally relied on two things. A, Christianity. This will be a Christian nation, and it was expected that 13 out of 13 from the foundation of the First Amendment will have some sect of Christianity established. And B, it would be up to the local governments to establish it. And I say these are the two most important principles for a sane Christian nationalism. The first one's called Christianity. It's got to be there. And number two, a localism, where it's decided at the local level, along with all the other moral questions. Those are my two requirements going forward. And it turns out those are the two of the church. It's 1,000-year-old tradition of in Catholic circles, Chase, this is called integralism, the integralism debate. In the wider American sort of fast secularizing post-Protestant culture, it's called Christian nationalism. But I think those are the two markers I would set out and say, okay, where are you on this, Chase? I think I know where you are, Will, but we should talk about this from within those boundaries today.
So you're saying the two markers are localism, each state having the choice of what kind of Christian establishment it has, and then what was the first one?
Christianity. Yeah, it's got to be Christian. Right. It is like on The Simpsons when the salesman is like, well, monorail. Mono means one and rail means rail. Like the Christian part is Christian. It's got to be local, locally decided, and it's assumed that it's going to be one of the Christian sects. This comes from 1555. And it's very, very American, very Roman Empire.
Yeah, and just to articulate the right bound of that, it seems like the frog Twitter people lean more toward the emphasizing, well, we just need to get power because we're better people, and if the people that had better morals had power, everything would be fine. It's just because bad people have the power, but once the good people have the power, everything's going to be fine and dandy.
Which is true from within the limited perspective that, yes, if you have to have a tyrant, better to have a Christian one. But it turns out when you look into it, this is what we're saying here. So this isn't the counter signal it might sound like. This is not what Aquinas or Augustine or Bellarmine or Suarez or any of the great thinkers, Christian thinkers of the past who have laid it out say. They say this should be locally decided. As a matter of fact, Pius XI says it's a natural law principle. It's a natural law principle that people ought to be making these decisions for themselves. And no, that's not relativism, and no, it's not secularism. That's a retarded modern designation, because once you start with the first principle, Chase, Will, Nick, that it's got to be Christian. Like America, it's going to be Christian. Now, of the original 13 states, what are you going to be? All right, well, it depends. Who are the people of Mississippi? I chose to move here, and I deal with the fact that they're Baptist. And guess what? I think it's the best state in America, and it's Baptist. Not because I'm Baptist, but because I would rather live here among them than among the douchers in my native California, very, very close to where you are right now, Chase. But so that's I think the guiding principle. It's got to have those two markers. What do you say? And then, well, I want to hear from you.
I would agree. So I want to zoom out a little bit, because this is Christian nationalism is something that I'm interested in. It's also a subject that I approach with humility, because there's a lot of different thinkers in the space. There's a lot of different perspectives of what Christian nationalism even means. I know two guys that have written books on it are Stephen Wolfe and Andrew Torba. They've both written books about this and what their kind of vision for what Christian nationalism means actually is. And you have people that are within the discussion, and then you have people like James Lindsay that are outside of the discussion, and they look at the concept of Christian nationalism, and immediately their mind just goes to a tyrannical theocracy that will subjugate and force all citizens of America to worship God against their will. And I think that's a straw man, especially when you listen to the majority of people within the Christian nationalism space. That's not what they're advocating for. And so I think, like, for me, I'm not like a political theory nerd. I'm somebody who has like spoken up about politics because I care about what's happening in the political machinery of America, because I think we're currently living under fairly satanic nationalism, and given the option between satanic nationalism or Christian nationalism, I would definitely prefer Christian nationalism. But I think it's kind of important to define terms, and I'm curious what your guys' definitions of Christian nationalism are. But when I think of it, so first off, you've got two things here: Christianity, and you've got nationalism. I'm a nationalist. I'm an American. I'm a patriot, but I'm also a nationalist. I want, as a nationalist, the interests of America placed first as Americans. Like, I want our country to win. I want our country to place our own interests first, as opposed to the interests of Ukraine or Israel or all of these other nations that are flooding our country with their citizens, that are diluting our cultural homogeny, which is important in America. It's important to maintain that. You know, if you flood a nation with millions of third world immigrants that don't share our values, I mean, America is going to go down the drain, and we're rapidly going down that descent right now. So I'm a nationalist and I'm a Christian. And when I think of Christian nationalism, I think of a nation that is filled with Christians who use the machinery of government to create laws that glorify God as opposed to opposing God. Right now, many of our laws oppose God. For example, like in a Christian nationalist country, I think we would completely ban abortion, right? This is like it's literally a satanic sacrament, and the slaughter of the unborn and occult worship to Moloch, whether or not people realize it. Who knows how much abortion within our country is fueling spiritual, supernatural forces that are perpetuating evil throughout our world. I would wager that there's probably a lot of that happening. So I think, you know, having a country where our laws actually glorify God and promote human flourishing in alignment with biblical principles, that seems like a pretty important aspect of Christian nationalism to me. It also seems pretty important that people are still given the freedom to choose whether or not they want to worship God. And I think that's an important distinction to make for people like James Lindsay, because they have this like caricature of Christian nationalism where they believe that everybody's going to be forced to become Christian. That's not Christian nationalism to me, at least. I don't think forcing anyone to be a part of one religion is, I don't think that's Christian.
It's Islamic.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. What do you guys think about everything I just said? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it?
I agree with it all. And basically what you're saying is that not only men, but societies, so men formed collectively, have a duty to honor God. And a good society is going to do that. And in Catholic Church teaching, this is called the social kingship of Christ. And popes have taught it going right back to the 5th century, goes back to apostolic teaching as well, that basically you can't relegate Christ to just your private space in the home. Like we say, it doesn't matter what people do in the bedroom. Religion becomes like that. Just do it behind closed doors. Just keep it to yourself. Christian nationalism says, no, it matters what we have in the public square. And Christian men have conceded too much ground, thinking that appeasement is going to lead to, I suppose, getting along with people. But all that's happened is that it has emboldened our enemies more and more. And when you said that abortion should be illegal, yeah, definitely. So should the mainstream distribution of porn, for example. That's, I think, to be illegal. And I think the reason this gets up people like James Lindsay in the wrong way, they feel affronted by it, is because, like you say, they think this is about using force, and somehow their freedom to not be Christian is then going to be infringed upon. So the Christian nationalism debate in their minds becomes about freedom of speech and what kind of lifestyle they want to live.
Yeah, and it's so important, in my opinion, to hone in on it, because as Americans, we have been conditioned in a culture of liberalism, right? We live in a liberal society, classically speaking. And when people frame the discussion about Christian nationalism in terms of theocracy and force, it instantly, like anybody who's a fence sitter who's considering this as a possibility, their minds immediately shut down. They're like, oh, Christian nationalism is a forced theocracy. I'm done. I don't want to hear about it anymore. I'm an American. I want my freedom. And I think it's so important to counter that narrative. And there are people within the Christian nationalism movement that are talking about forced theocracy, and I think that's going to stir up a tremendous amount of opposition towards actual tangible progress, which I think is dangerous for our mission. But yeah, dude, you gave a perfect definition of it. I love that. I also want to add to, I think in a proper Christian nationalist society, abortion would be banned, pornography would be made completely illegal, and I think we got to do something about usury as well, fellas. What do you guys think? Yeah.
That will never be viewed, and they have on Catholic podcasts on Usury, because of the development of fiat currency and changing definitions. But what's vastly agreed on is whatever usury is, they changed the definition sometime a couple hundred years ago. It is completely anathematized in the church, and I mean, more than that, like, we're not going to do a whole Fed thing. But the Fed, like the Federal Reserve, is absolutely corrupt. It's absolutely central to the globalist Ponzi scheme of cultural Luciferianism. You have to have centralized banking, and centralized banking is based on usury. So we could say that capitalized debt, all that, and the Catholic Church has long spoken clearly with legitimate developments of doctrine. Most of the time when people say development of doctrine, it's pure bullshit. This is one of the few grounds. I had classical theists on my show the other day. We had a friendly debate on Pope Francis, and we agreed on that. Usury is a classical conception of actual development of doctrine based on changing global definitions of a term like that. But I wanted to...
Tim, real quick, out of curiosity, before we move on, I know that the Catholic Church has had a long tradition of opposition to the money changers, shall we say.
Yeah.
What is the Catholic Church's position on usury?
That it's always and everywhere a grave evil. The debate, once the church categorizes this is a grave evil, it's always and everywhere grave matter, meaning the objective part of a mortal sin. Anytime you cooperate with it formally or approximately materially, that means anytime you have any significant part in it, it's automatically the objective part of a mortal sin. The only area of development was not that, but rather what? When usury changed legitimately in scope of definition from all interest on a loan to a loaded term, a distinction of degree, where it's like, well, an evil amount of interest on a loan, that's where you get all the trouble. And the advent of fiat currency, or the popularization of it anyway, and some other monetary fiduciary issues caused the change in definition. But the church is still clear. All usury is grave evil. And I think the most useful way to address it for us is like, well, central banking involves, as its raison d'etre, usury. So we can't be down with that. And the Fed.
Very based. In total agreement.
Dope. Well, like I want it because Will threw this great James Lindsay tweet out, and where it's not a great James Lindsay tweet, but it's a great prompt. Will's amazing at finding good character foils for what we're doing shows on. It's actually remarkable. And it was basically just James Lindsay, rather, it was kind of a long tweet with several parts, and I don't want to read it all, but he just said that Christian nationalism is identity politics. And that's bullshit. Even though I think all of us here seem to have the same perspective on it. We like it. We like it out of the popular context. But immediately I was brought back to this distinction in literature between metonymy and synecdoche, whereby in one you're speaking and you're saying, you know, the White House spoke this morning, and you take something that's more plural, and what you really mean is one representative of it. So the great grand plural stands in for actually one person saying something. And the other one, metonymy synecdoche, is the opposite. You say, you know, this is more common. There's one representative that speaks, and you actually mean the entire thing. So you say, oh, a suit spoke this morning. I spoke to the brass this morning. And you just mean one guy, but it represents the entirety of a company or some sort of corporate body. Identity politics is objectionable precisely when one part, qua its essential properties, is said to stand in for everyone else. And that's always and everywhere wrong. Christian nationalism is the opposite. Christian nationalism is the vibrant part of any res publica. Any republic is good if it's built around a common civic thing, like the social kingship of Christ, to get right down to it, since Will already opened that can of worms. That's why we ought to have countries. It's both a supernatural scriptural principle. It's also a natural law principle, though. We join together because we want our rights protected. That's sort of the efficient cause. But the formal cause of all polities is social kingship of Christ. So it needs to be there. And that is, if we strip it down and we put it into the plebe discourse, that's called Christian nationalism. And so it is the opposite of identity politics, the way synecdoche and metonymy are pure opposites. That was my complex thought or whatever when I first heard of it. And I just want to say, not identity politics, if you guys wanted to crack at that. Whether or not we say we need a nuanced form of it, not identity politics. James Lindsay is he's full of beans.
Yeah, well, I think I commented to you last night about the image of Shia LaBeouf receiving communion on his knees in what looked like a traditional Latin mass. And I was like, this is sort of where there's differentiation between the colloquial use of traditional nationalism, Christian nationalism, and what you and I are advocating for, which is that creed is superlative and everything else follows after that. So your race, your gender, and your former creed don't matter if you submit to Christ, because that is actually transformative. And if you doubt that, then you're doubting the transformative power of Christ. And so Shia LaBeouf is, we'll say, descendant of the Old Testament folk. And nothing gives me more joy than seeing him submit to Christ in the form of the Catholic Church. And if you miss that, if your identitarianism stops you from embracing Shia, you've lost the plot. You've completely lost the plot, and you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater there. You're
like ethnic identitarianism or something like that?
Yeah, ethnic, or even... What? Hang on, can you specify what you're asking?
You said if your identitarianism keeps you from realizing the beauty of the Shia conversion.
Yeah, right now it's typically an ethnic identitarianism that people care about the most.
Yeah.
And it's clearly relevant like statistically relevant for crime, for predicting earnings, for cost of living. Like all of these things are accurate, but there's also a reason why everything was totally cool when Jesse Lee Peterson was a kid. Jesse Lee Peterson actually talks about this. He grew up under Jim Crow laws, and the percentage of black fatherlessness was roughly identical to white fatherlessness before the New Deal, before the state stepped in. So,
Great Society. It's Great Society that changed it. All in 62, 63. Great Society.
And that's like, that just shows you that if your creed is the same and your creed is true, you don't have to spend a whole lot of time looking at 23andMe's. Because you know how somebody's going to... You know how people are oriented, and so you know what they're striving for. And that just takes precedent over everything else. Now, it's not the only thing, but it's the primary thing. So that's, I think when I say, like, I'm a Christian nationalist, it's taken a long time to get to that point. Because my generation is so concerned with your 23andMe and not as concerned with, like, true submission to the person of Christ.
That phrase, Nick, of it taking precedence over everything else, I think really gets to the heart of it. And what Chase was saying earlier about when people hear the mention of Christian nationalism and they think authority, and then they think one step from that is tyranny, and then they're coming for my liberty. The idea of anything taking precedence over their freedom is what terrifies them most. Whereas the Christian understanding of freedom is that it's ultimately to do God's will. It's subordinate to what's true, what's good, what's beautiful. We don't place freedom above those things and say that there's freedom to have abortions, for example, or freedom to rape. There's no true freedom at all. So the idea that we have to say that the state is ultimately subordinate to the church, the spiritual, is the thing that transcends the political. It's like overarching. This is the big challenge to the secular liberal worldview. And it pretends that it is beyond or totally outside the paradigm of religion. But really what it does is it just sets up new idols for us to worship. You're going to live in an integralist state, whether you like it or not. It's just whether it will be satanic or Christian.
Okay, I want to rewind for a second. When James Lindsay is attacking Christianity or Christian nationalism as identity politics, can you guys, like, I really want to clarify, because James Lindsay has a lot of influence. I really want to clarify what is it exactly that you guys think he means there? Because when I think of identity politics, I think of like Black Lives Matter, for example. Like, what is it that he means there?
I think he's dog whistling to... Man, I got to choose my words so carefully.
Do you want me to read it first? It's a big gay multi, but let me read 3 and then you go.
Can you, Tim? Can you send it to me as well?
Yeah, I'll send you the pic. Yeah. Here, let me do that first. So, what he says is, let me send it to you as I read it, so you can follow along. What he says is, I think it is a dog whistle. I think this is ultimately the way that this ought to be looked at. He says, the second part is the really dirty part. Members of these activist groups actually hold themselves out as the capital O, only true members of their groups. Feminists are true women. Q activists are true G's. CNs are true Christians. So they get to represent the whole class. Then they turn all criticism of them as activists, hags, idiots, psychos, narcissists, manipulators, liars, and jackasses, generally Gnostic elects, he thought that was really clever, into a wound-collecting mission, saying the critic attacked the class. Low information members of the class are targeted next. So he's saying that any political advocacy that's organized around a res publica, a legitimate one or an illegitimate one, you see how relativism is at the heart of his critique, is illegitimate, and that's just bullshit. He said it's all, identitarianism. The feminists, he says, Q activists or CNs go cry foul to the whole groups, women's, G's, and Christians, and say, we're under attack by these bad critics. Don't listen to them. It's obvious why people chasing power would do this. It gives them the power of numbers they don't have. So he's identifying any sort of political advocacy group with any kind of organizing principle, legitimate or illegitimate, as identity politics, which is just stupid. And he thinks it's really clever. And this is why, again, I left academia, because these guys think it's really clever when he's saying, i.e. Gnostic elects, capital G, capital E. No, there's an organizing. You were going to make some point, I think, going in exactly this direction. But there's an organizing principle, and it's either good or bad. And we have to designate before we designate whether or not it's identitarianism, which is false, or true politics, centering around true religion. We have to identify whether or not the political advocacy is good or bad. He's trying to do it without a North Star, and that's nonsense.
He's implying there's a kind of Christianity which makes no claims in favor of a generic state theism, a Christianity which would tolerate Satanism being taught in schools, for example, to young kids. And that's not the case.
Yeah, it's funny because, so I think it's a sort of a ceremonial hand washing and virtue signaling to crap on identity politics and identitarianism and say, like, under no circumstances is this a good idea or is this a safe idea. We can't tolerate it in our society. And I remember when, like, the intellectual dark web was doing this. You had Sam Harris saying this. Then it became in vogue for Jordan Peterson to start saying this, like, oh, that's identitarianism. And then you had people like Richard Spencer who showed up on the scene and started advocating for, white identitarianism and stuff like that. And all of these things stumble on the part where you're recognizing, well, there is one kind of identitarianism which is good, and that's why it's the predicate, the Christian part of the nationalism. That's the identitarianism that's cool and okay, because that's not submission to, like, phenotypes or latitudes or cultures. That's submission to the person of Christ. So that does trump everything, but in an effort to be like the guy, this Tim Pool fence sitter who never actually says a distinct point, they'll just say, oh, well, all versions of identitarianism are toxic and evil and scary and bad.
Question for you guys. Did he post this after the whole calendar gate thing?
That's what started all off.
Is that what inspired this tweet thread?
I don't know whether it was that directly, but since that, he's been talking about it a lot on his timeline. And I think that's because that calendar, which you weighed in on and a few other guys did, asked questions about what is conservatism. And I think that's why it was fresh on his mind. What's conservatism without Christ? Without the social kingship of Christ, what does it mean? A conservative often ends up just being a liberal who is a few years behind where the liberals are.
Yeah, see, it's a relevant question because I love this concept that you guys are describing of the social kingship of Christ. I've never heard it defined like that before. I've been obviously familiar with the concept of that kingship in my mind, but I've never heard it defined in those terms. And the reality is that true American conservatism fights for the social kingship of Christ, right? The definition of conservatism on a cultural level is the maintenance and the preservation of traditional moral values. Traditional moral values in America, as we all know, are Christian values. This country has historically been a Christian nation. True conservatism fights for the social kingship of Christ. But that definition of conservatism, as our country's culture has been watered down and destroyed over the past 70 years, that definition of conservatism has been lost, and conservatism is now just like fighting for lower taxes and keeping your gun rights and your First Amendment rights while tolerating every other form of cultural degeneracy humanly possible. That's what conservatism is now, generally speaking, today. And James, his attack on this concept of Christian nationalism, I think it speaks to something, and the response that all of the Christless conservatives had to the whole Calendargate thing, it's all in the same thread, which is that if Christians actually stand up for true Christian morality in America, we're going to have to tear down a lot of idols that are worshipped by all of these people who don't worship Christ. There's a lot of idols that are going to have to be smashed. And all of the people who don't worship Christ are going to fight against it, and they're going to attack Christians and Christianity throughout the process. And so in a sense, like, yeah, there are identity politics involved here. And James is trying to say, I'm looking at these tweets on my screen here. He's saying that if Christian nationalists get attacked, even if they're idiots and they're being attacked because they're idiots, they're going to say that Christians are being attacked in general. But it's like, that's a straw man. It's not idiotic to attack secular degeneracy as not being conservative or Christian. It's not idiotic at all to do that. It's actually Christian to tear down those idols. And if you're going to attack Christians for doing so and say that they're idiots in the process, it's not on us to be like, hey, it's not our fault for saying, hey, these people are attacking us for our Christian principles. You're just attacking us for our Christian principles. At the end of the day, that's what you're doing. And if people are going to do that, like, yeah, it's like, rightfully so. Christians should stand up and say, look, they're attacking us for our morality, because that's what our country is. Our country is geared to attack Christian morality from almost every single angle nowadays. And the only Christians that are actually holding the line are people like us that are saying, no, we're not going to stand for that. And I think this is an interesting thread. I think any Christian nationalist, anyone who's actually standing up for Christ in the public square and pushing back against all of these idols that are being worshipped, we can expect more of this. It's like, dude, I tweeted a few weeks ago. I was on Tim Pool's podcast talking about the Antichrist and biblical prophecy and stuff back in December, and I tweeted that porn should be made illegal. The number of people that came after me and attacked me as a result of saying that was insane. Many of whom were Christian. Many of whom were Christians that were like, dude, it's not our job to dictate what people do. Here's the thing, though. It is our job as Christians to prevent the proliferation of evil throughout our nation. Right? That's absolutely our job as Christians. The idea that everybody should just have free reign and access to porn is like, I don't support that. I don't think porn should be protected by the First Amendment. I don't think it's just some like fine, morally neutral thing. You guys know that kid who went viral because he had the Gadsden flag patch on his backpack, and his teachers were saying, no, you're not allowed to have this because it's a racist symbol. And then his mom came in and she was like, no, this is like a symbol from the American Revolution. It's patriotic. His name is Jaden Rodriguez. We connected on Instagram recently, and he messaged me last night on Instagram, and he was like, hey, he was asking if he could come on the Whatever podcast and speak to these OnlyFans girls that are producing pornography online. And the reason why he wanted to do so is because pornography is actually a huge issue at his school. I think this kid is like 11 or 12 years old, and he was saying that 80% of the boys at his school are watching pornography. 80% of the 11 to 12-year-old boys at his school are watching pornography. They're watching, God only knows how degenerate, the different and warped and twisted the videos that they're watching are. And it's like a Christian nation, like a Christian nation with Christian governing principles is going to protect young boys from being exposed to that. And you're going to have to tear down some idols in the process of protecting young boys from that. And I think that's where all of these attacks from people like James Lindsay and all these other secular, classically liberal types are going to come from, Yep.
And the calendar brought it up, Chase, because sex is always the hot topic. Whenever these people sense that the sun is about to set on sexual degeneracy, sodomy in particular, and gay marriage, they start screaming. and they run for the hills, because that's what it fundamentally boils down to. Wilhelm Reich, member of the Frankfurt School, said that the sexual process has always been the core of the cultural process. So the enemies of the West trying to undermine it understand this with crystal clarity. Why is the sexual process the core of the cultural process? Because the family is the foundation of society. As the family goes, so goes the family. And if you aim at promoting promiscuity and degeneracy, as the feminists said they were going to, guess what? You're going to bring about social chaos. So in many ways, the family is where patriarchy is either brought to fruition or it fails. So traditional sexual morality is a really important topic for us to defend. And that's why guys like you have been speaking out, guys like us have been speaking out. And it's where you get the most heat often, because it quickly uncovers the liberal beneath the conservative mask, because they don't really care too much about any of it. They quite like it because it's fun. It's the use of their freedom, and they think it's legit.
Yes, dude, I completely agree. And I want to clarify something else for you guys, too, about my position in the culture war. A moment ago, you said, how the family goes, so goes the family. Did you mean how the family goes, so goes the nation?
By extension, yeah. Family, society, then nation.
Yeah. So I'm absolutely a subscriber to the idea that the family is the building block of civilization. Many people make the argument that the individual is at the core of civilization. There's an argument to be made there, but I personally believe that the quality and state of the average family, that is going to be a reflection of your nation as a whole. And I think that Satan's master plan here, this is incredibly obvious to me. His master plan is to do everything that he possibly can to attack the family, the health of the family, and in particular patriarchy, because as we all know, that is God's good and natural design. That's what protects. Godly patriarchy protects against every kind of degeneracy that we can imagine. And Satan obviously wants to do everything that he possibly can to destroy that and to invert the family and God's natural order. That's why we've seen feminism and the sexual revolution wreak so much havoc on our civilization over the past century. And the pornography in and of itself is an attack on the family, because it's an attack on good sexuality, godly sexuality, but also on men especially, right? Like, men who are addicted to pornography, they are having their life force drained from them. They are having their dopamine receptors just screwed up beyond recognition. It screws up the way that men look at women. And I would argue that pornography is a large part of the reason why many men today are not living up to their fullest potential. Because if you're addicted to pornography and you're just having your life force constantly drained by succubi on your screen, you're not going to become the kind of man that God has designed you to become. And sex in and of itself, I believe, is possibly the idol that is most worshipped in our modern culture. Like, our culture is it almost entirely revolves around sex, sexual freedom, sexual degeneracy. Like you said, man, whenever anybody stands up for godly sexuality on the right, but people on both the right and the left start to freak out, and they're like, don't you take my degeneracy from me, man. This is as closely held of a freedom as my right to free speech and my gun rights. It's like, it is the idol that is worshipped in our modern day. And as long as conservatives continue to operate from a paradigm of Christless conservatism, there won't be progress that's made towards restoring God's natural order in this arena. And like, that's something that we have to get so clear on culturally, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Tim, you got a little fun fact in your book, which wasn't it until 1947 the First Amendment made it illegal to disestablish Christianity as the official state religion?
Absolutely.
Am I right recording that?
Yeah, Everson versus Board of Ed, 1947, reversed the meaning of the First Amendment. We had 7 out of 9 Freemasons on the Supreme Court. Number would rise to 8 out of 9 in the 50s. But the First Amendment makes illegal the disestablishment. I mean, just go check it, people. It's the only of the original 8 amendments, called the Bill of Rights, that specifically mentions Congress. Congress is not allowed to make a law respecting the establishment of religion, which had always existed in the states. State legislatures set establishments of religion, and it was illegal for Congress to disestablish them. Well, 7 of 9 Freemasons on the Supreme Court, starting in 1947 in Everson versus Board of Ed, said this meant its absolute opposite by incorporating the First Amendment against the states. This meant it's illegal for states to have establishments. This goes against the entire history of the country. It goes against the reason for being of the First Amendment in the first place. And the proof is that 13 out of 13 states were expected to have establishments of religion. I also wanted to point out,
Tim, can you define what that means and a state establishment of religion?
Official state. We have to be careful because state is capitalized, in the Constitution, because really state means country, and it meant country in America too, right? We're a country comprised of country, empire within empire. But state religion in the American tradition, the First Amendment tradition, literally means that every state was contemplated by the First Amendment to have an official sect of Christianity. They were Congregationalist Protestant in the North, Puritan, one of the many sect of Puritan in the North, and they were Anglican in the South. And the framers of the First Amendment, Jefferson and Madison, were surprised that 5 of the original 13 states opted out. Remember, we ratified the Constitution in the summer of 1788, and 3 summers later, they gave the promised Bill of Rights to the Anti-Federalists. And they expected that 12, they thought maybe Rhode Island would be gay and secular about it, but they thought 12 or 13 out of 13 would all have official state establishments of Christianity, meaning that the darling of the lawfare of that state. And what you also said, that under the this is why Christian nationalism is such a big, nuanced topic where I have to take a little bit of breath before the discourse begins, is because localism is so hardwired and softwired into what it is to be an American Christian. We need to be deciding at the state level what type of Christian we're to be. There is no such thing as a conservative, an American conservative, or a conservative simpliciter without Christ. People say, well, where does this leave conservative blanks or conservative blanks? Well, I don't care. True conservative means Christianity, and it means localist. And the other way you prove this is because in 1947, when the Supreme Court, when the Freemasons on the Supreme Court uncoupled America from our sovereign right to decide our own state's local sect of Christianity, they did so under the 14th Amendment. Well, 22 years later, Chase, in a case called Stanley versus Georgia, they used the same 14th Amendment to say that it's illegal for individual states to illegalize the prawn. And it had been illegal in most of the states. This is also a local issue. All of the red states and even most of the blue states, until Stanley versus Georgia in 1969, already had it illegal. It had been illegal since time immemorial. This isn't something we need to illegalize. It was actually the nationalists, the secularizing nationalists, who used the 14th Amendment to make it illegal to illegalize prawn. In 1960.
What is the 14th Amendment?
14th Amendment is one of the Civil War amendments, the big nationalizing amendment that makes it basically illegal to have localism, that was brought in 13th, 14th, 15th. And it's essentially a new constitution. So not only, I just want you to consider this. Here's all of the second half of the 20th century elements of Christian lawfare that were uncoupled from American life by use of secular nationalism. 1947, you get Everson versus Board of Ed. You make it illegal, what had always been legal and presupposed to be Christian establishments in the states. You make it illegal for states to have establishment. 1965, all of the based states had made gay contraception illegal. And they made it illegal to illegalize it in 1965 in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut. Note, in all these cases, it's a state, one of the base states that's being litigated against. 1969, you have Stanley versus Georgia. They make it illegal to illegalize prawn. The nationalists. 1973, 4 years later, they make it illegal to illegalize abortion. It had been illegal in most of the states. Then you get Texas, Lawrence versus Texas. They make it illegal to illegalize like SOD. It had been illegal in most of the states. They made it illegal to illegalize it. And then, of course, under Obama, they made it illegal to illegalize SS unions, same-sex unions. And the point is that when the states had this sovereign right to legislate for themselves, all of the good ones had it right. It's only when the nationalists come in, they always do the wrong thing. I always ask people on the side of nationalist conservatism. Yeah, of course, nationalism is better than globalism, but localism is better than nationalism. Why do they have all the right Christian aspects of lawfare when red states decided for themselves? And why did it get reversed only nationally? Think of all those issues that Christian nationalists say they care about. They don't even know this tortured history of the second half of 20th century. Also, I just wanted to, I know I've spoken for a while, but I wanted to tell you, Chase, the specific address of the family being the single cell of society. I promise not to engage in serious apologetics here, but it's Catechism of the Catholic Church 2207. It's addressing very specifically I have to say it, the Martin Luther idea that the individual is the single cell of society that gets carried all throughout the Reformation. And the church is like, no, the family is sometimes they say the original cell of society, sometimes they say the dynamic cell of society, sometimes it's translated the single cell of society. The individual building block of culture is the family, not the individual. That's an idea that the Catechism has fought for these 500 years against.
So I actually, dude, I love. As a Protestant, I've really enjoyed discovering the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because one of the great advantages that Catholicism has is that it's really clarified and crystallized its position on so many of these different social and moral issues. And I just pulled up the Catechism 2207, and I want to read it for anybody who's listening who hasn't read it, because it's brilliantly articulated. It says, "The family is the original cell of social life. It is the natural society in which husband and wife are called to give themselves in love and in the gift of life. Authority, stability, and a life of relationships within the family constitute the foundations for freedom, security, and fraternity within society. The family is the community in which, from childhood, one can learn moral values, begin to honor God, and make good use of freedom. Family life is an initiation into life in society." That's brilliant, and I particularly love the part where it says authority, stability, and a life of relationships within the family constitute the foundations for freedom, security, and fraternity within society. That's absolutely correct. Super valuable point that you brought up there. Also, I want to rewind for just a moment. It sounds like in order to have true Christian nationalism and true localism, a lot of Supreme Court decisions would have to be overturned. Is that correct?
Yeah, you'd basically have to say the 14th Amendment, you'd have to say with the force of law, the 14th Amendment and its incorporation doctrine, its state action doctrine, all this stuff you got out of essentially a new constitution is null and void. And there are some really specific legal techniques that could be used to do that, if there is any will. The problem is now there's very little political will, political capital, upon which one would launch that project, because you get things like Christian nationalism. Like, I love that. I mean, all the states should have an establishment of Christianity. Now, I'm not going to be a Catholic to move here to Mississippi and, without a lot of ex-ante evangelization, tell all these people that Mississippi is going to be a Catholic state. but each of the states should be a sect of Christianity. That was America from 1788 until 1947. Yeah, so there's that, and people will say, well, what about the blanks? They live here too? And it's like, I mean, the problem is pluralism. That's really where we agree full-throatedly with the Christian nationalists. Like, pluralism is fake. There are, from all the political...
What do you mean by that, pluralism?
The idea that our differences are our strength. What a res publica means that you affirm one thing with every citizen of the society. A res publica means a public thing, a publicly loved thing, as St. Augustine calls it. And all the Republican theorists, from Aristotle to Montesquieu, the big guy they're citing at the ratification debates at Richmond, Virginia, they're saying Montesquieu, and people think, oh, isn't he modern? Isn't he a lapsed Catholic? No, he said he had big rules. One of them was you got to keep the republic geographically small. The other one is it's got to be univocal religiously and morally, meaning everyone has to be the same religion and believe in the same thing. And then you get Madison with Federalist 10. We're indoctrinating our kids in 9th grade. Read Federalist 10, where it shows, well, this is how you have a big country with lots of factions. How do you solve faction? With more faction. And this is what the nationalists have to believe. It's utter nonsense. There's not a political theorist worth his salt out of the Christian tradition, which most of these guys are Catholics, but you get good Protestant political theorists that say stuff I like Buchanan and Rutherford and Hugo Grotius and Samuel von Pufendorf that are important as well in this political tradition. It sounds like a clown college or something, but they all say the same thing. You have to all be the same kind of guy. If Christians don't like prawn. Well, there are other groups that call themselves conservative. I won't mention who they are, that love it. It seems funny we have a clash of values here. Yeah, of course we do, because a res publica means you have to all be the same religion.
Yeah, I'm reminded, I think it was an Augustine quote, where he said, sin is believing that you know how to make yourself happier than God knows how to make you. Something to that effect. I think that's that spirit of Gnosticism, Arianism, is really the backbone of a lot of like the James Lindsay stuff, where they think that any kind of it's by definition Protestantism, because if you say, well, you have to do X, Y, and Z for moral option, and they say, but I don't want the morality, I want the freedom. I want the freedom to be able to do wrong. Which pope was it? Help me out. He said
liberty versus license.
Yeah, it's like you should have the freedom to do the right thing, not the freedom to do all things.
It's a robust political tradition. Liberty is ordered, freedom oriented at the good, so it's guided. License is freedom oriented by nothing. So this is
and so it's just term. Like everyone's getting circle jerk freedom thing, trying to defend freedom and liberty over. Got us paying attention.
This is where the surrogation of license for liberty got us.
Right. Yes. Bait and switch.
Right.
Yeah.
Pope Leo 13th was big on that and talked about how the separation of church and state was the fatal principle, as he described it. And he was very concerned to warn everybody about the dangers of the Freemasonic agenda, to try to remove all Christian influence from the big public institutions, specifically schools, and how the aim was to turn marriage into nothing more than a civil contract, to legalize divorce, abortion, all the rest of it. Basically, things have turned out exactly as he said. And we're warned about it in Romans 1 as well, verse 28. As they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind to do those things which are not proper. And the West is finding that out in a hurry.
Yes, it is. Those damn Freemasons, man. Gotta watch out for them.
Got us. They're like
been working towards the complete destruction of all that's good and true for the past 250 years.
But the good news is, it's like the vampire can only enter your house once you've let him in. That's a really profound point in literature, fairy tales. Like the devil's always at the door, but you can resist temptation with God's help. So We've got ourselves to blame in many ways.
Yeah.
You know, the way I conceptualize it, the snake is always in the garden.
Yeah, exactly.
The best way to resist the temptation of the snake is by actually listening to God's word.
Right. And that's also, I think, another reason why ethnicity as the superior filtration mechanism, because you can say, well, this group of people foisted this evil upon us. This group of people foisted this evil upon us. But which group of people consented to? Who engaged in the business transaction? No, there wasn't a gun to the head. And 99 times out of 100 of the main issues we're talking about, whether it's distribution of pornography or the transatlantic slave trade or even the Federal Reserve, it was like several centuries of requests that the good people of the world said yes to over and over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ethnic debate is an interesting one because once you start digging into that and the pornography and the Federal Reserve and all of these different things, you do start to notice patterns. There is a discussion to be had about the ethnic stuff, but maybe that's better discussed on a private stream.
We'll get banned. I had a stream with E. Michael Jones about that, and I got my channel banned for a couple of weeks. The point I love there, though, is people who bring up IQ. Well, if you wanted to have IQ as your metric for what makes a superior ethnic group, you can make the case that people have been tricked by a group with high IQ, like Nick's describing. Someone got the upper hand. Well, how did they do that? I'm going to jump off for a lesson in a minute, guys, but I just want to read this quote from the British historian Christopher Dawson. He said that if the state has become too totalitarian, it's because the average Christian hasn't been totalitarian enough. He's acquiesced in the secularization of life. He's allowed his own aims to be divided and his religion to become a sectarian affair, cut off from his real interests and life. So part of the crisis of masculinity in Christianity is Christian men being too timid and giving up the public square to their enemies. So men need to be bold and actually do their duty to proclaim Christ and his social kingship properly. That's what I want to finish on.
I mean, that's a mic drop right there.
Dude,
yeah,
that was strong.
I say we call
strong.
it there.
Will, great to speak with you, man.
Yeah, you too. Pleasure to meet you, Tim, Nick. As always, good to speak to you too. Take care, guys.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who watched and listened today. Hopefully, more of Chase, a sovereign brother, as his.
Do you guys want to finish the stream right now?
Yeah. I think we should wrap it up here. We just passed an hour. But you'll hopefully be seeing more of Chase here, and I don't know if Will's frozen for everybody else. Thanks for coming on. I feel like this opened a can of worms, and there's more questions next time as well. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Oh, dude, it was my pleasure and honor. Thanks for having me on, and I feel like there's a lot of interesting threads that we could go down that are worth exploring, and part of me wonders if some of them should be gone down on a platform other than YouTube. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe a Rumble stream or a Twitter space.
Yeah, but it was fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, God bless you.